Okay, great. So we have this set up, and basically all we did was create a primitive, right? We created a primitive and we edited some of its properties. But this is really key to understanding Illustrator, right? In Photoshop, you would have to, even something simple like a square, you'd have to draw it, and you couldn't kind of freely transform it and change its size and change its color with one click, right? So in many ways, just while we're here, I want you to get a taste of why Illustrator can be faster than Photoshop. It can be more flexible. It can be, for some type of design, it can be much more powerful. You can make copies of anything. You can instantly color things. And when you get the hang of drawing in Illustrator, it can be just refreshing and easier than Photoshop. And Photoshop kind of gives us like an art-like process, like it's additive, like you add more and more layers. But Illustrator kind of has the feeling of, cutting out a shape and then setting that shape aside and then being able to use it for almost anything. So in my mind, Photoshop is kind of like a painting analog, but Illustrator is truly like digital. It's like truly a digital form of art. If you miss setting up if you are struggling to find the layers, know that in any window, anything that you want is always under window. So you go window layers if you're having problems figuring out those little symbols. That's totally fine. Adobe designs everything like I said, to be like double or triple redundant. So if you're having trouble mastering stroke and fill, just know that whenever you make a shape, they're usually up here in this bar, depending on how you have it configured, right? So this is something, gosh, I see this all the time. I can, these initial things are almost the hardest thing in Illustrator. And once I teach you like shortcuts and more complex things, the tendency in my class is that everybody forgets the initial things, and then everyone is like, I don't understand how to change the stroke, and my stroke isn't changing. I can't click it, right? And so I just recommend taking it slowly and really focusing on this assignment and really get an understanding what all these little controls mean, right? So that's the stroke is in the foreground. Now the fill is in the foreground. This is off. I can set it to none. And this is the last color I used, right? And then this is switch. So this little cluster of controls, gosh, I use it so much every single day, and not understanding it or not bothering with it because it's too small is just not going to work in Illustrator. All right, so now let's open up libraries, and the libraries are in the swatches palette. And this is one of the other things that's really cool about Illustrator. Once again, if you can't find a swatches palette, just go to Window Swatches. So another really good thing when you're getting oriented is just to open all these windows and see if you can get a sense of them, kind of intuitively. Most of them you can, but swatches is really great. Another cool thing about Illustrator is that you can basically assign these interiors, right? So whatever you have in the swatches palette with your object has to be selected, and then the fill has to be forward. Just click around in here and see what some of the pre-made things are, right? So we can change the color super easily. This is unique to Illustrator. You have patterns. You can fill it with a pattern. And then you might think to yourself, if you get the implication of this, like, yeah, you can draw these patterns. You can have a huge library of patterns. You can go online and buy these patterns. You can do, the more that you study as an artist, and the more that you grow as an artist in Illustrator, the more assets you have under your control, which is also kind of different than Photoshop. I mean, in Photoshop, you can save and reuse things, but not to the extent of Illustrator. In Illustrator, if I draw a tree or something like that, then every time I need a tree, I just open up my file of trees and I drop it in. So, all right. So let's explore. So we're just looking at swatches, and if you don't have those things, just explore libraries, right? So in the library, you'll see patterns. So let's look at, whatever, decorative patterns and explore those patterns. Cool. So you have this pattern library open. And then the other thing that I always work with is the gradient library. Um, and just pick any one you like. Gems and Jewels is really pretty. And I think, see, what you're trying to do is just get comfortable with your screen. The reason, this is a huge jump for some people. If you're at this digital threshold of like sending emails, and part of the barrier to becoming a designer and using these programs really well is just knowing that there's all these little floating sub controls around everywhere, right? But once you kind of acclimatize yourself to that, it becomes kind of cool. Um, all right, so you can open as many libraries as you want, and just assign your big background shape something from the library. But we are going to compose stuff on top of this. So maybe, and this is one of those things that I said I wouldn't teach today, but I will take the transparency palette and make it like a little lighter, just so the pattern doesn't confuse my eyes. Cool. Okay, so you can ignore that if you want. But it's good to know where the transparency palette is. And of course, if you don't know where something is, you just go to Window and open it. Now, with my layers palette done, I will lock my layer. And I'm going to go back to my list to make sure that I'm focused. So simple primitives, we've done that. We made that rectangle, right? So, color libraries, we have done that in the swatches palette. And we're just constantly getting oriented to Illustrator. And we sort of have learned about layers. All right, cool. So with this locked, let's say I try to draw another shape. See how it says I can't? That's another common thing. Illustrator gets way more complex than Photoshop. I mean, a million times more, because each shape retains its properties and can be re-edited, and each layer can have 100 shapes in it. So you just have to there's no like nice or easy shortcut to it. You have to learn where you are in your layers, and you have to learn how to control that, right? So if you work with any layers palette closed ever, I think in all Adobe programs, you're kind of messing up. All right, so my background is locked, and now I'm going to make some other shapes. So let me just explore here, and note that it's set to the last setting I just had, which I want to change. All right, so see, I'm doing an oval now. And then let me just change that setting. So it'll always retain the last setting that you have. And then I'm going to bring that stroke forward, and I'll set that to black. So this is just everything that you're trying to do. Every shape, just place a shape, manipulate the stroke and fill. What I'm looking for in this project is just that you are in control and you're able to change it, right? Like if I just use that same pattern over and over, it would show that I didn't know how to change stroke and fill, right? So, okay. So back to my ellipse tool. And it's okay to have a few that are the same, obviously. If I add option to that pole, I have to be moving the mouse already. If I add option, it'll draw from the center. If I add shift, it'll make a perfect circle, right? So just in keeping with the spirit of our assignment, I'm making a change to stroke and fill for everything. Cool. All right, so now we have a couple circles, and I accidentally drew a tiny one. Watch out for that. That's another little symbol that you don't understand Illustrator. It's what you see in a lot of beginners, especially in this assignment. You see a lot of this, and these are little baby circles. right? So you have to be in total control over your mouse, and you have to have a mouse that's really comfortable for you as well. There's nothing. There's a lot of times there's like this game mentality of clicking faster will improve it, and people have those habits. That stuff does not work in Illustrator at all. All right, so now we have a polygon. And it has a default setting of being six-sided, and then I'll just swap stroke and fill to get a new kind of thing. While I'm clicking and pulling, I can press up and down on the keyboard to get other shapes, right? Cool. So I pressed down a couple times on the keyboard and I got a triangle. The same thing. Well, these all draw from the center, unlike the circle. But you can experiment with Shift and Option. Okay, so Shift makes sure that it is aligned in an upright manner. That is great. Really, really easy, right? And now finally, and then the final tool here is the star tool. And please don't use the flare because it can use up all your processing power. So the star will just draw you a Mario star. And remember, I mean, this is simple because it's meant to be simple. If you find yourself not understanding Illustrator further on, like do not skip this assignment, just go back and do it again. I do this assignment as a warm-up because the controls are so different between Photoshop and Illustrator that it's really great to just, warm it up and get myself sort of remind me of the concepts of Illustrator before I start my artwork. All right, so as I was saying, here's a star. Now, if you press up on a star, you'll get multiple spines, multiple points, so you can get these really elaborate stars. And if you hold Option, that will define the radius, right? Okay, so Option and Command define the radius. So just by way of showing you, so see how that star is pretty tight in the center, and then the spines are really long. That's because I held Command. So just play with Option and Command. And once again, it's not important. It's not super important that you memorize everything, especially when you're first starting. But know that Shift, Option, and Command will always modify whatever tool you're using. So I don't have it completely solid in my mind, but I know where my modifiers are, and my hands kind of automatically go to them. So then I go, oh, was it Shift, Option, or Command? And I can try out each of those quickly to get the result that I want. So we did this. So now we have this setup of a few primitive shapes. That's all this is on a big background. And now we're going to talk about selection versus direct selection. Now you see me using this a lot already. Selection is the black arrow, and direct selection is the white arrow, right? Now here's what they do. And now this is the kind of thing, boy, when I do this in class, everybody skips it. And then like I said, almost everybody who skips it, like, just does poorly at Illustrator. Like this is the one concept that you have to understand. So shapes have levels, right? In Illustrator, they have the level of the entire shape, and then they have the level of the components that build them, right? So whenever you use direct selection, you're selecting the entire shape, and you can automatically transform it, right? Now, if you could do this in Photoshop easily, Photoshop would be a more powerful program and maybe wouldn't need vectors. But the fact that you can compose way more quickly means to me that Illustrator is better for composition, right? without having to go through that transform command every single time and wait for the computer to render the transform, et cetera, et cetera. So when you think about, like, if you have something that involves geometric composition, Illustrator would be better. So just experiment with what it's like to move these shapes around, transform them, and then while you're holding transform, you can rotate. Rotate is in there too. While you're holding transform, see how it can distort it. You can distort it, and you can also, if you want it to keep its same proportions, then of course you hold shift, right? Like every Adobe program everywhere. Now there's another thing involved in this, is that you can immediately copy shapes using direct selection, and the way you do that is you just add option to your flow here. So you have a few copies, right? And even though this is going to be maybe a little out of bounds, I think it has to do with selection. So let's just say that it's in our topic. So I can just directly click on something and move it. But another thing I can do is I can just drag a box around a group of things. And I might say, like, oh, that's a symbol. That's something that I want to remain together. So if I want something to remain together, I just do Command G for group. And that command, remember, everything is redundant, is under object, object group. And there's also ungroup if you want to separate them. So, okay, so now I have this little object. And then if I hold option, I then have, I can make dozens of them. And if you see that this looks like a little tree, this is kind of the basic abstract concept of how Illustrator works. It's sort of like, yeah, you build up little shapes and then you color them. Then you group them into these arrays, and those arrays form your illustration, right? Cool. So anything graphic, flat, shape oriented, I will almost always turn to Illustrator. I've seen people do painting in Illustrator, and I'm not really big on that because I used to do a lot of painting in Illustrator too, and maybe I'll show that to you. But I think there's programs that just handle it better and make it more intuitive. So Illustrator, if you think about these flat graphics, you are thinking on the right track. All right, so now next we'll look at direct selection. Forgetting the difference between these tools, which invariably most students do, is just it just means you can't be good at Illustrator. So when you have direct selection, which is the white arrow, you can then access the components of the shape. Right? So to understand this, let me go to this star here. So a shape not only has its whole self, but it also has those components, and the components are things that you learn from, in grade school. Like this shape is made of points and lines, right? So if you click exactly on one of those points with direct selection, then you can change the nature of the shape. A line is also a component. Oops, got to turn off my touch control there. So line is also a component. So if you click directly on that line, then you can move it too. Now, I want you guys to explore the errors, which you saw me doing some of them. So here's the big error between these two. The biggest error in Photoshop, in Illustrator, is over clicking. It means like you think like clicking around a lot will give you some result. In Photoshop, that does give you a result because you're painting, so it adds more paint. It can look cooler just to click, click, click. In Photoshop, you have to plan. In Illustrator, you have to plan your clicks. It's much different. So if I'm at this level, my whole object is selected, right? I'm using direct selection. I mean regular selection, right? So my whole object is selected, and it can be easily transformed and moved around and easily copied holding option. Now, when I want to go to direct selection, the whole object is still selected from the previous tool. So I can see the points. I know exactly what I want to do. I understand it. But the whole object still moves, right? So then I think, So then I kind of give up and I think, oh, I'm doing something wrong. I don't know. And then you click around somewhere else. Then you get out of your object and you get lost. So there's two things that you have to do. If you to move from selection to direct selection, you have to double click, right? So then I've clicked on that point and I can double click that line. Okay. And then the other thing that you could do is you could not have anything selected and just know where the points are. And then the tool will reveal a point when you get over it, right? So now I can see that point, and in that case, I just have to single click, right? So really practice that, and the way to practice it is to, go from deselect. I click on the background. See if you can just grab that point and move it, right? Then choose regular selection, grab the shape, and then do a little transform or something like that. Then move to direct selection and see if you can understand that you still have the whole object selected, right? And then to grab a line or a point, I need to find it and double click precisely on it, right? So you can see, like, Illustrator needs a high level of precision. Whatever that means. My touchpad on my Mac is awesome, and I can always navigate my points with it. But I think part of it is just your psychological approach to what a program is, and just know that it's precise. You always have to hit these points. In other programs, they kind of give you a bigger hitbox maybe, and make it a little friendlier. But when stuff is friendlier and bigger like that, then it means you can't always get exactly what you want. So in order to use a precise tool, you just have to be precise. All right. So okay, cool. So that's the other thing I want to see in this exercise is that you are able to manipulate these shapes, that you're able to use swatch libraries. You're able to manipulate these shapes so they're not just vanilla primitives. They're something that you can create. And then while we're here, we should look at a curved one because they're different. All right, so curved point, and this is something just to hold in your mind, but don't worry too much about it. A straight point is like this. It just connects to the line. A curved point connects to the line and to these two vector control rods, right? So this is another beginner thing. See how it's getting more and more complex, but all the complexity is just it's just mental, right? Like you just have to understand it. So see, anytime you see a curve, it'll both join the other lines and it will show those vectors. And the vector control rods give you, it's almost like force, a unit of force, right? So if you say like, oh, I want this curve to be bigger, and you open that control rod. But see the problems I'm getting into here, where my rod can be right on top of the line. So then that is so hard to discern that that's not a point, right? That's not a point. That's a control rod. But the indicator that Illustrator gives you is the ends of those rods are balls, and the points are squares, right? So you just have to learn that, and you just have to adapt to it. This is another thing. This assignment I've learned to teach it slowly because. Basically, it's something that you can breeze through really quickly, and you can say like, oh, he just wants me to draw circles and squares, done, on to the next thing. But having control over these points and being able to manipulate these really easily is probably the most important skill that you can have in Illustrator, right? When you move on to the drawing, because you can draw these things too, and when we move on to those tutorials, you'll be totally confused if you don't understand these mechanisms, right? So for now, straight points And then if you draw, whenever you draw a circle, just know that any point that has a curve will have those two little handles on it. All right, so now the final part of this tutorial. We're going slow for a reason, because this is how much time you should spend on it, so that you really understand it. Okay, so the final point is making compound shapes, which we'll use in a project. Right, so compound shape works like this. I have one shape selected. With the selection tool, I hold Shift, and then I select another shape, and I want to combine those together. So for that, I'm going to use the Pathfinder window, which actually I don't remember the symbol for it here. So always rely on your Windows palette. So Window Pathfinder. Okay, I can find that out by just collapsing it. Oh, that's the symbol. Okay, I guess it wasn't up there anyways. Oh wait, there it is. There's a little mini one right here. Okay, so that works. Like I said, one of your biggest challenges is going to be like keeping track of all these windows, sort of memorizing the names in your mind. And maybe we'll have a. I mean, that would be a good thing to quiz yourself on. Selection, direct selection, the Pathfinder, the swatches palette. So those are things you do just have to remember. All right, so the Pathfinder tool lets you combine shapes, and we're going to start with this one. This is just a simple compound shape. Any combination of two things in mathematics and geometry is called a Boolean combination. So these are called Booleans, and they're named after the mathematician that created them. All right, so 2 stars. So this is compound. I have 2 stars, and I'm going to choose intersect, and now I get a weird intersected star. Cool. So your piece here should also show. So I'm looking for a range of shapes. I'm looking for a range of compound things. Let's try another one. So we did intersection. Let's just do minus front. So that's minus front. Cool, right? So basically, being an Illustrator artist means that what you essentially do is you draw a ton, and then you think about geometry, and then you come up with ways to approach these shapes. Like, this is something that could be really useful in a logo, like a star with another star cut out of it, right? So it's kind of like there's people that are all different kinds of artists. Like, I'm dear friends with people that are painters and have a painterly approach to work and use Photoshop only and would never touch Illustrator. That's great. And then but Illustrator is more like, it's kind of more like an engineering mindset where you can still make really beautiful art, but you have to have a sense of making a drawing and then devising a plan from that drawing. That's basically the feeling of Illustrator and why it's just a little bit different. So let me see here. So this is basically, yeah, I mean the piece just looks kind of random, but I want to see a solid exploration, some gradients, some patterns, and I want to see in particular that you are able to control selection, right? And that you're able to manipulate these little interior points. And I've done this a lot, so I can see that at a glance, right? If this assignment is just all regular primitives, that's not very good. I want to see that you're making compound shapes and that you are manipulating direct selection, and that you are involved in the color libraries, stuff like that. And I guess it's a bonus if you, at this point, play around with this and try to make something graphical or something that makes sense. But I just want you to be able to control and have mastery over all this complexification of this new interface. And that is basically it.